Now, today we're going to continue, and for this course, complete the historical survey. And our subject is Rome and the Middle Ages, the two cultures that came after Greece. Now, a word about the predecessor of Rome, and that is the Hellenistic era, which is usually dated from Aristotle's death until Alexander. They had many differences, but in essentials, they were culturally the same. And in fact, in most areas, the Romans took over the Hellenistic viewpoint and adapted it in minor ways to their own view. So it's commonly called the Hellenistic Roman culture. And as far as our concern is, studying merely the Roman is quite sufficient. And for Rome, I'm going to pick literature and education. Literature in Rome is just as important and just as eloquent as in Greece. And the best period to get the Roman view of expressions in literature is about 100 BC to 100 AD. As in Greece, epic poetry is still the essence of serious literature. And, unquestionably, the most famous of all Roman epics is the Aeneid by Virgil. Virgil wrote that explicitly. He said, I'm going to be Homer, but I'm going to be Homer as a Romer would do it. I'm going to do just what Homer did, this great epic, but expressing Roman rather than Greek outlook. Virgil's work was an instant success, embraced by everybody on the street, intellectuals. It was very soon made compulsory in the schools. So whatever is in Virgil is Rome, as far as literature is concerned. And one of the best ways to see the distinctively Roman mind is to contrast these two great epics. And actually, the whole history of the pre-modern world is three epics, each perfect for its time. The Iliad, the Aeneid, and the Divine Comedy for the medieval period. If you read those three and you suck in everything about them, you don't even know anything more about what preceded the modern world. Well, that's a little overstatement, but Virgil follows Homer in applying the same, what we call divine machinery. He's also, his characters, he preys on the gods and they study omens, they affirm the gods' powers and so on. But whereas the Homeric gods, as we saw, are morally not too good, morally defective, and ultimately indifferent to what happens on earth, Virgil's Jupiter, that's the equivalent of Zeus, Virgil's Jupiter is flawless. He is perfect. He's an august being. He has a plan for human beings, and he's deadly serious about it. Now, the whole story is set thousands of years in the past, before Rome, and Aeneid is like the first in what's going to be a long story. So God's plan is nothing so parochial as Zeus's. It flows from a much more ambitious. Zeus just wanted to make peace between two countries. But as one commentator puts it, in the Aeneid, the stakes are higher. It's the will of Jupiter that Rome shall be founded and conquer the world. And this view of Roman dominion is a central part of the cosmic world order, as Virgil presents God's purpose. God is shaping the whole world by the triumph of Rome. So Jupiter's plan bears a real similarity to the plan of the Christian God. Each ordains a historical progression that will culminate in the emergence of man's ultimate link to supreme reality. Jesus, for one, Rome for the other. In both cases, now God's connection to man has been manifest on earth. Now, given the metaphysical scale of his plan and his powers, Jupiter is much more hands-on than Zeus, much more active and detail-oriented. And also, he's so powerful that he makes the achievement of his purpose and every step leading to it inevitable. Independent human purpose or efficacy in this epic is a myth. As Aeneid, the hero, puts it, all men are under the rule of, quote, fortune, that no man can resist, and fate that no man can escape, unquote. Zeus can be put to sleep, but Jupiter is always watching. Now, both Homer and Virgil, the stories have digressions, but nevertheless, they each present an inner sequence of events which has a real logic. In other words, it's integrated. It's not just a collection of episodes. There's a goal, and the goal dictates the events. But in a very different way that they are integrated. Homer takes a historical fact, the chief's injustice, and then unifies his events into a plot by dramatizing the specific human choices and actions that follow from the incident. Virgil's chosen task is not to select, but to include, to cover the events of the millennia from Aeneas' own time all the way to the founding of Rome in the far distant future. Now, on the secular level, if you don't know about God, there is no logical connection among these events. Obviously, Aeneas, as a human, has no plan for 2,000 or 3,000 years from now. And no explanation is offered in the story as to why shipwrecks and so on happen as they do. And Aeneas regularly tells us that he's baffled by what's going on. Now, we know that the epic does have its own inner logic, but that eludes Aeneas because the unifier of the story's elements is not a human purpose, but a divine purpose, but God's purpose. And so the various steps that Aeneas goes through are presented as necessarily connected, but they are so only because they flow from a transcendent origin and mandate. So we can put it this way. For Homer, the gods are an expression of nature and as such obey its laws. For Virgil, nature is an expression of God and as such obeys his laws. And Virgil goes so far, it astounded me when I read this, an utterly anti-Greek, it's Platonic, but anti-classical Greek formulation in the Aeneid. He says, mind is the creator of matter, which, if you carry that out, that's the end of the pagan culture. So here is a crucial difference. And we're talking about this in literary, not philosophic terms. If you took out Homer's divine machinery, you just left out all the gods, we saw that it would not affect the essence of the work. But if you took that out of the Aeneid, there would be no story at all. No purpose, no progression. And the most you can imagine is you'd have a ship of city planners seeking a site for a future capital, which there would not be epic material. And it's not an accident that Dante later wanted a pagan guide for the early part of his tour of the next world. He wouldn't dream of choosing Homer for that, but he did pick Virgil, who he described as, quote, the best of the pagans, unquote. Now, characterization. Iliad and the Aeneid are exactly as opposite as their approach to story. The secular hero, Achilles, confronts a knowable world of nature, as we saw. And so he's confident of his rational faculty. And so he's independent, he's passionate, he's egoistic, he's proud. But Aeneas, by contrast, views reality as fundamentally transcendent. That's the technical word, in the more popular Reader's Digest word is supernatural. But both mean some realm beyond nature. He's transcendent, the reality is transcendent and unlimited. And therefore, anybody like Achilles who thinks, oh, I get it, I know it, I can deal with it, is just deluding himself. And here again, a good quote. This Jenkins is a very intelligent man. Aeneas has to cope with a world which has now become in some ways incomprehensible. As Aeneas enters the underworld, he doesn't die, but he stops off for a visit. Virgil prays to the gods that he may be permitted to speak of what he has heard and reveal things hidden in deep earth and darkness. Virgil puts into our minds the notion that it is very difficult to say anything about such divine matters. He suggests that to Aeneas, the revelation of things unseen is a special dispensation, and even so, though much is revealed, much remains unexplained. And a Sibyl in the work, a minor prophetess, declares, man is commanded to obey, not to understand. By the way, in describing the underworld, Virgil does not present to Homer's wretched pile of corpses, but rather the ultimate admirable home of justice, where divine rewards and punishments are handed out. Now, this is early 1st century AD. Now, I don't mean to minimize the fact, even though he's a baffled epic hero, he's still an epic hero. As long as he's pagan, he has to exhibit the qualities lionized by Homer, strength and persistence and so on, but these are not the focus of his character. Virgil stresses not his hero's similarity to the Greek heroes, but his difference. Aeneas is admirable not because he sets the course of his action and brooks no interference. It's the opposite. He's admirable because he is an obedient servant of Jupiter. And he says over and over, if you want to describe me, I'm, quote, Aeneas the dutiful. And that's illustrated throughout, most obviously in his affair with Dido, is that right? It's a woman. Never heard it said. Despite their passionate love for each other, when a word from God, they're in the midst of this torrid love affair, a word from God, for no reason given, reminds him he's got his duty, he better quit. He instantly aborts the relationship, although the Virgil presents eloquently the agony of Dido. He stresses and approves it because Aeneas is causelessly does what he's told. Now, of course, this stress on being indifferent to worldly desires and being prepared to give them up, as you must know, is a clear manifestation of the Stoic viewpoint, and that was very, very popular in Rome throughout, and increasingly so. It's difficult for characters who lack personal desire to be made fully real by an author. And this is a fact you can see in the development of Aeneas. Remember how real all of the characters in Homer were, or going forward, the characters in Romanticism. But what we see, and this is another commentary, in Aeneas is, quote, and he doesn't do this because he agrees with my theory, is, quote, a kind of dehumanization. The hero seems less accessible, less of a well-rounded character in the second half of the poem, and that is definitely part of Virgil's design, because in the course of the epic, Aeneas has made the transition from being an individual to his true essence of being, quote, leader of the people, the abstraction without the concretization of his loves and hates and all of that. And so here you see most fascinatingly characterization turning into ideology. A concrete person with loves and passions becoming the principle of doing your duty. So the abstract meaning of the work. Now, a lot of works, including Ayn Rand's, have abstract meaning, but it's expressed in real individuals. But in Virgil and in a whole school like that, above all in the 17th century, the abstract meaning begins to usurp the reality of the protagonist. So that more and more he's a speech rather than a person. And of course, God is that. We have nothing to individualize or concretize God. So the way you can put it is the message is starting to consume the messenger. The abstract statement eating up the person. And in the end, the story is largely about an abstraction serving an abstraction. The dutiful serving the Almighty. But now the other side, this is a pagan after all, albeit Roman and not Greek. However much Virgil elevates the next world, however much he invokes a priori abstractions, he does not reject this world. And he does not reject the perceptual concretes that make it up. He, with the Romans, regards nature and man's perception as derivative, but nevertheless real. Real and valid precisely because they flow from true reality. And the worldly side of the epic is seen and enjoyed and approved by the author everywhere within it. Now, it's very important, as an example of this, the goal to which the epic, God and Aeneid is dedicated, is the city of Rome. You know, the worldly empire, not the city of God. City of God put them in this position and told them to do it. But what he told them to do is go out and conquer the world. And the characters, despite their commitment, pages stick together. Despite their commitment to God and duty, clearly believe, and again with Virgil's obvious approval, that some worldly desires are really good because God wouldn't have given them to us if they weren't. And therefore, we should enthusiastically satisfy these desires. And therefore, they're all shown, most shown approvingly as extravagant banquets presented in loving detail, not only on earth, but even in heaven. When they visit the other world, they don't wail and they don't play harps or sing hymns. You would be amazed at what these people do in the other world as Virgil projects it. They have athletic contests. They dance to and sing songs from their former life. They own swords and horses. They love chariots and armor. They have great feasts in the grass, etc. So life after death for them is really life before death, but with cheaper rent. Virgil is a worldly supernaturalist. And that, if you explore, is also true of the other really two serious writers of Rome, Seneca and Apuleius. Virgil, achieves unity among the secular elements of his epic through a transcendent purpose to be achieved on earth, but by characters with their heads merging into the other world, but their feet still on the ground. So that is perfect M1. Perfect M1. See, the way antedates Descartes. Descartes just resurrected. All right, now as to physics, we can do that in a sentence or so, because there is no distinctive Roman physics. Romans were generally uninterested in broad theory. They thought it was unimportant because impractical, which indeed it was in those times. There was no industrial revolution, and they thought it was just idle speculation. And those who were involved generally took up the physics of one of the Hellenistic philosophers, mostly Epicures of the Stoics. So we can forget that. The Stoics are arch M1, if you read my book. All right, now the one I want to take a little bit of time on is Roman education, because it is a wonderful example of philosophy being influential entirely by mode and ungraspable by people who don't know that concept and never made explicit. Now, I have to say as a preface that Roman education changed a number of times. It went on for 1,000 years. But nevertheless, I believe there is an enduring, distinctive, common approach. And I may say that the last era, the last few centuries, were by far the most historically influential. The last centuries, which was really the more decadent, or not decadent, but less good part of Roman education, was the only educational ideas of the whole ancient world that survived to influence the West thereafter. And that was picked up by the medievals, the moderns, and all the way into the early 19th century. The last few centuries defined education for that huge amount of time. Now some contrasts again. Greek education was value-oriented throughout. Its goal was for the child to become the human ideal and gain a life of personal happiness. And so they sought to develop the essential qualities of man. I think I mentioned, or if I didn't, gymnastics for the body, music for the character, and literature for the mind. But the way they wanted to develop these is to always keep in mind the great heroes. It wasn't only Achilles. Keep in mind the ideal, the strong, the independent, the egoist, and that's what they were teaching them in these various forms. Roman education replaced value with duty. In the early Roman centuries, the boys' teacher, girls didn't really get education until way later in the modern world. In the early Roman centuries, the boy's teacher was his mother, in the very early days. And after that, his father, mostly his father. His father, of course, was not presented as a hero to be admired. He was told that his father's entitled to respect, not because he's Achilles, not because he's brilliant, but because he's his father. He had drummed into him, what you must pursue is not admiration, any of that, but obedience to duty. Duty to your father, your family, your ancestors, the traditions of Rome, the men in authority, and above all, the Roman state. The highest duty, he learned, is duty to foster the supremacy of Rome, regardless of any personal opinions. And you see, that's the same, that's the goal of Aeneid. So that the culture is so heavily oriented to Rome as an entity to which the individual is subordinate. Now, as the centuries passed, the parents fell away as teachers and they were replaced by professionals, but the centrality of duty remained. And the Britannica, believe it or not, which is usually full of bromides, has a really good sentence here. Quote, if ancient Greek education can be defined as the imitation of the Homeric hero, that of ancient Rome took the form of imitation of one's ancestors. You can't beat that for a formulation. Now, they also called like Aeneas a hero, but it's not the hero in the way Homer could be, but it's a hero of utter willingness to give yourself to duty. So Aeneas was certainly presented and lionized in the classroom, but as a symbol of renunciation for the fatherland. And there's another, now I want to recommend Marrou, M-A-R-R-O-U, a really excellent history of classical education. And he writes as follows: as against the wild and imaginative Homeric hero, Roman heroism never had any particular individual character. It was always strictly subordinated to the public good and the public safety, unquote. Now, like the Greek, Roman education wanted integration. In the technical terms, it is monistic, mono meaning one. In other words, there's in this context one basic goal, and that dictates all of it: the curriculum, the method of teaching. And that is, of course, if you can call something monistic, that's the guy who's after unity. So D is up. And once it's monistic, it's either I or N. But since the ultimate goal of the Romans was different from the Greek, so was the curriculum. First of all, the Romans got rid of gymnastics and music. Gymnastics, the Greeks had held in the nude, and that's just out of the question. It was effeminate and immoral, out. If you want physical education, they said, you should be concerned not to develop some kind of personality in the boy, but teach him to serve the state practically. And the two main elements was teach him hygiene and get him prepared for battle. That was the Roman equivalent of gymnastics. Now, they didn't think much of music at all. In fact, much of any arts except literature. That was also impractical. And the idea of young boys singing and dancing, as they had in Greece in school, that was at minimum frivolous. So the essence of the real Roman curriculum was the third of the Greek subjects, literature involving language. Now, on this point, the Roman approach was very similar in general to that of the Greeks. In other words, the boys studied fiction, primarily epic poetry, along with noted speeches and other nonfiction Roman writers. There was nothing else to read. So they read the crucial things that they had at the time. And they started with the 3 R's, which at that time included geometry. And then they were taught some facts and ideas from history, mostly Roman history. Again, there wasn't much else. Well, they had the Greek. They taught something from science, but there wasn't that much science. Something from medicine, mythology, geography, religion, other areas. But there was usually not enough known in the various areas to organize it into, a course that you'd present to beginners. So as with the Greeks, the material was generally introduced piecemeal, when the teacher thought at some point would be helpful in the study of the literary work under consideration. The point of the difference here, though, is the Greeks featured the study of great writers primarily as an aid to the child's self-development. The Romans were interested in the practical, the socially practical. That would be practical in relation to the group, to the state. And therefore, they sought to the study of literature, through the study of literature, to turn out men who were efficacious in relation to social political issues. Men who were politically efficacious. And of course, in that context, it wasn't by TV ads. You had to be great at oratory and rhetoric. If you learn to write an eloquent sentence, if you learn to argue logically, and if you learn to present your views persuasively, then when you speak publicly as an adult, people will hear you, they'll listen, they'll follow, and if you're saying the right things, you will be of benefit in fulfilling your duty. And those logic, eloquence, and persuasiveness are exactly the skills taught by the great poets. So how do we achieve this in the student? If you told a modern teacher his curriculum should include only practical subjects, he would probably throw out, first of all, grammar. But the Romans took the exact opposite view. If you want expertise in thought and action, they believed, you must first have expertise in words. You have to know pronunciation. You have to know spelling. You have to know the interrelationships among words. You have to know the rules governing their interrelationships. In other words, you must have a really good knowledge of grammar first. Now, Athens did not go in this direction for a number of reasons, but at minimum, there were no comprehensive grammar books yet. So the teacher didn't have much, comparatively much to go on. But the Hellenistic era, which just preceded Rome, there were a wealth of big, utterly comprehensive books on grammar known at the time. And so the Romans latched on these as, as a godsend. So they held that the grammar actually is a prerequisite not only of success in politics, but in any field, since all fields depend on the use of language. So they said we have to start the kid with grammar from day one. And that's why their huge emphasis on grammar from beginning all up just gave us the name grammar schools, which survived because they were schools based on and oriented around grammar. Now, you have to know some details, if you'll bear with me, to grasp that what this means. Words are abstractions, apart from proper nouns. What happens when the mastery of words becomes the basic concern of schools? And after you get that mastery, we'll then study and deal with real issues. That means that the study of concrete entities, of the very concrete entities which are the reference of the words, is secondary. You don't bother with that much in the early years. It's a waste of time. The proper use of time in these early years, and that, of course, sets the mind for all the rest, is indicated from the very beginning by learning the alphabet. I just wish I had an hour to take you through this. To me, I fainted when I read it. I mean, it's perfect for my theory, but I didn't believe it would happen. This is how they learned the alphabet. I'm quoting from Maru. First, the boy goes forward from A to X, and then back, he's 5, say, and then backwards from X to A. Then in reverse pairs, AX, BV, CT, et cetera, then jumbled into different combinations. And then after the letters came the syllables with all their combinations, and then single names. These stages came one after the other, and there was no hurry to get on to the next. You might spend months and years on just da-da, trillo, da-da, A-B, one after the other until you finally got it. And listen to this one. Rare words and those most difficult to pronounce were deliberately chosen for the first reading lessons. As because they want them to feel the words and don't worry about, we want expertise with words. Now we're ready for the relationships among words, which is grammar, and its meticulous distinctions and classifications of words as words. I couldn't take you through that. For instance, when they studied nouns, these are 7-year-olds, say, learn 27 classes of nouns. And of course, all of this is, I'm not going through it all, but all of this preparation is to prepare you to be expert, read the classics, read Virgil. But this is the idea of teaching Virgil. Now, one guy, Priscian, if that's his name, he was a late Empire author, of a treatise on how to teach literature in the form of dialogues between the master and the student. His whole entire book covers 12 lines of verse. The first line of each of the Aeneid's 12 books, one line only of each. So here's an example, even a partial example, of the study of the first line of the first book. These are among the many questions he asked the student. Scan the line. The number, name, and location of the caesuras. Number the figures and their division into different kinds of rhythmic patterns. Give me the names of each kind of metric foot. Explain how many nouns out of the 27, verbs and other parts of speech there are, and then in regard to the first noun, its quality, kind, gender, and so on. I'm just giving you a taste. That is how the children read and studied Virgil and Homer. They could take any word and give you everything about it, but there was very little time to focus on what was happening. Now, you see, it's consistent from the beginning. Thereafter, alphabetic expertise, which is the ability to distinguish and manipulate symbols. And then grammatical expertise, the ability to analyze and manipulate words. And then literary expertise, which is the ability to find these analyses and manipulations in the author they're studying. Now, then the final consistent end result was that they dropped the promise of political practicality. Because in the empire at that point, you had no chance of being a politically independent, effective person. So what was long implicit became explicit. The teaching of grammar as a primary never stopped, but the teachers turned away from the world. As one author puts it, they became, quote, out of touch and sympathy with reality, unquote. Or as another one put it, they became scholastics in education. And this is what schoolboys were given to debate after they had their linguistic training. Like maybe 9, 10. The nature of deflowered virgins, the licentiousness of married women, the ceremonies needed to combat pestilence. Now, most of these boys knew nothing about these subjects, but nobody cared about the content of what they said. It was how you said it. Was it polished, grammatical, rhythmic, stirring, and so forth? And another excellent commentator, quote, I didn't put his name down though, they were called upon to admire not the adaptation of language to thought, but the language itself, unquote. Now, of course, this means the primacy in education, using the Greek terms, the primacy of form over matter, of abstraction over worldly substance, of rationalistic logic over observation, of concepts over persons. And that means that the ultimate educational reality was floating abstractions in Roman education. Now, you see, the teachers don't talk about that. You can go to any Roman school and say, what's your epistemology, or what's your theory of concepts? They haven't got a clue. But if you know what you're looking for a mode, you see floating abstractions, and you know that's one striking example to me. Now, I don't mean to imply that the Romans were Christians, of course, but they were always much more religious, well, take out the much, more religious than the Greek, and they got increasingly so in the empire. And so you see the teachers in the empire, as the centuries of Rome's fall went on, they had little difficulty in uniting their grammar with their gods, because they were both in another transcendent spiritual dimension. So you were ripe for God after you got out of grammar school. both with the supremacy of the spiritual over the material. But now again, I have to remind you that these schools were still pagan insofar as they were Roman. And they aimed to produce not the ascetics in the desert, but Roman patriots. And they even tried to claim that the education served this purpose, not so much anymore, by the efficacy of political oratory, but by enabling the student to understand and be inspired by the worldly epics of Virgil and Homer. So the floating concepts were still intended, and the teachers and the students believed it, ultimately to be put to use here and now, ultimately to help us connect, understand, and explain this world. So if you know Plato's divided line, like 4 stages, starting with the most abysmally ignorant and rising finally to the man who grasps the form of the good, or God as the Christians would call it, you could say that the Roman educators didn't want to do what Plato did, which is climb right up to the top and take off. They wanted to climb as long as necessary till they got all that a priori in their minds, but it was important to return to the world and the rewards that Plato himself had scorned. So again, it's worldly supernaturalism. They never end up saying, I want to go up there. It's a nice place, and I'm close to it, but I like to enjoy it here. The funniest of that is, I shouldn't take it to. Can I take 1 extra minute? Apuleius wrote The Golden Ass, and it's all a funny comedy. But the very last, he discovers Isis and Osiris. He's converted. He's deeply religious. He goes up to, I forget, Osiris, I think, and says, I'm thoroughly converted. I give my life for religion. What should I do? And it tells him, go home and be a lawyer. Well, St. Paul would not say that. So you see that the Roman educators achieved integration by accepting an a priori transcendent reality, but upholding as a derivative of it the world of nature and its study. Again, M1. Now, politics, we have to just skip by. Probably it has 2 phases, the Republican era and the Imperial era. I think both of them are essentially the same, but some people think it was a huge change, but we can't go into that now. But there are certain well-known principles of both of them. They were both collectivistic, they were both duty-ridden, and they both made a big thing about God as their validator. The collectivism and duty orientation of the Republic ultimately is what led Rome into the direction of more and more statism, culminating in the emperor. Now, it has been said, and I totally agree with that the Roman emperor was the ancient equivalent of the 17th century absolute monarch. He was Louis XIV. He was not Stalin. I'll comment on that later, but although he claimed unlimited power, and he claimed, some of the emperors, that he was actually God, man, the way Jesus was supposed to be, he was still a pagan phenomenon. He was still bound by the fact that God's requirement was worldly success. And the implication on that was people can judge his requirements. If he goes wrong, he's giving them grounds. Even though he claims unlimited power, he's putting the ammunition out there. Whereas, in other words, he does not have moral authority. Nobody regarded the 17th century emperor or the Roman emperor as, what's that word? Infallible in faith and morals. He had the army, he had the military, so he was infallible that way. But the people were, by the system, allowed to think in their own minds even, this guy is wicked. And, he might take offense at what you said, but you were still entitled to say it. And in that way, he was nothing like the totalitarian leaders. Plus, he had no ideology to spread. Nero, if he had all the people, had nothing to brainwash them with. He just wanted to be debauched, kill every once in a while. That's a different thing. So there is an essential difference, even though the emperors invoke God all over the place and claim their unlimited power, it is not the totalitarians. So with that quick look, we can say that the Romans are consistent representatives of M1. And now I want to turn to the Middle Ages. I assume you know Christianity, so I'm not repeating the content of the document. There was a lengthy preparation, and finally the distinctive developed the Christian culture is mostly the 13th and 14th century. And I told you the towering literary epic is Dante. Achilles had peeked into the underworld and found it repellent. Aeneid made a longer visit. He found it awe-inspiring and morally uplifting, but then he came back to his earthly goal, which was the founding of Rome. Dante's epic is set entirely in the afterlife. It has no part of it takes place on earth. And he makes it clear that he's relieved that he left all these things behind. We're moving through a dimension, or we're in a dimension that is in essence timeless, spaceless, non-material, morally perfect. Now, of course, he's using man and props to communicate this to us, but they're just props. Now, Virgil is the guide that Dante picks at the beginning. The whole thing is a tour through this afterlife. And he takes Dante through the lowest rungs, and what we see is the agonizing punishments of the obstinate sinners, or the punishments put forth by God. And then the next stage is the fierce struggle of the penitents in purgatory. They're sorry, but they haven't been forgiven yet. At which point, we're getting too noble for a pagan, even Virgil. So Beatrice takes over, and she leads Dante through the different grades of virtuous souls. See, it's like Plato. You get closer and closer and closer to the top. All these souls being joyful for being in paradise, and the progression moves ever nature until you reach the climax, which is God. Now, what about action in the epic? Well, man entered the epic only after their physical action has been completed and judged by God. So the poem does not present physical action. There's no battles, no storm-tossed fleets, no conflicts among the principals, no act of revenge, no act of politics, no mission, etc. Earthly desires and actions are regularly mentioned, but particularly as an explanation for a sinner's sufferings. But these actions are not dramatized. You don't see the people fornicating. They merely remember it and tear their breasts. And the actions of one sufferer have no connection to the sufferer of another. It's like a hospital ward of the soul. And you just go from one to the other, and it tells you the horrible things he did and how agonized he is. So it has nothing to do with it doesn't present what happened in the past. It presents the reward and punishment a given soul deserves now. Nor is the presentation, the angel comes and gives him a birthday cake. It's just a spiritual forgiveness. What it really then presents is the conceptual analysis of sins and their interrelationships. There's a lot of concern about how you distinguish this sin from that sin, how they interconnect to each other. Those abstractions are what the work primarily focuses on. So the leading character, who's Dante himself, is really the opposite of Achilles and even of Aeneas, because he is a spectator. He is, in effect, a straight man who, until the final canto, when he has his epiphany, experiences pretty much the standard emotions of a tourist when he's put in an exciting new locale. Wonder, sympathy, pleasure. I mean, everybody who goes to Garden of the Gods has the same reaction. One of his stronger interests is in rehearsing standard theological riddles, which are really of great interest to him. How could you solve the Trinity and the Incarnation? Now, what about the fact that the Son has to issue from the Mother, but from certain points of view, the Mother has to issue from the Son? This is S-O-N. Do we ever hear Dante's personal reactions? Well, we learn that he loves Beatrice. But what do you learn about his love for Beatrice? It's a vague generality, although often repeated. No love words, no notes, no stolen kiss, no electrifying touch, no hint of desire. All of these would be thrown out as profane love. And Dante tells us we must from all these things be released. We should be aflame only in the pleasure of the Holy Spirit. If you become interested in worldly things, including love, but all worldly things, you are turned away from reality. You're falling into the unreal world, going all the way back down the divided line. And what you want to do is reach the realm of abstractions. Now, Dante is pretty close to a total abstraction because we know almost nothing about him, but Beatrice outdoes him. This is the totality of what you find out about Beatrice. Quote, she is gracious, beautiful, smiles sweetly, talks a lot of theology, and changes clothes when she is near God. That's it. I mean, that wouldn't get you anywhere on Match.com. So I shouldn't be sarcastic. In the book, I'm not sarcastic, but to this, she always has a veil covering her from Dante. I think always, certainly at the beginning. And she suddenly disappears. She's just gone. No one can recognize such a person physically or psychologically. She is not a woman or even a human being, but an abstraction. And that's commonly noted according to various interpreters. She's really Jesus, or she's really theology, or she's really revelation. You can go on from there. So this is way more than dutiful Aeneas, who had this passion for Dido and gave it up. These people have no temptation, no inner conflict. They're eager to throw aside whatever personal identity they may have in order to be absorbed into the infinite. They are abstractions used didactically to present the essentials of a philosophy, of Christian morality. And in that way, the theme of the book, is the content of the book. It's the relation of abstractions to other abstractions. Homer's egoists are concretizations of an abstraction and therefore are fully real to an audience. Virgil's part egoists are semi-concretized, so they come across as real but less real. The Christian non- or anti-egoists merely float. There's no element of personal feeling left to give them personal identity. So when Dante reaches God, It's, of course, an incommunicable mystic experience. He can only describe it, what he describes as generalities, and it amounts to, it was joy and inspiration, it was blessed, and the analogy, the word he uses is light, L-I-G-H-T. This world is darkness. In other words, the absence of light, which is nothing. And God is reality that is light. And God's light streams forth. So this world is, and our world is this light, is God's light in darkness. So qua this world, it isn't. There is no such thing. It's not necessary. It's not only bad, it isn't there. It's just that our clouded senses give us this idea. But we should follow the light to find reality. What we have is an unsubstantial haze. Everything is either God's light or what he calls the reglow of God's light. In other words, the reflection of God's light. And God's light is not really here because everything is in God. And as he puts it, God's light breaks into separate rays which never leaves God. It leaves God and breaks into separate rays while never leaving God. See, it can't leave God because that's reality. So it extends here, but only to our warped perception. And if you look at it metaphysically, as he's using another metaphor, the scattered leaves of the universe in actual fact are fused into, quote, one simple flame. Now, perfect, the one without the many. Now, he knows, of course, that this rests on faith and the a priori, and he even hints at being a rationalist, but I won't take time on that. The Divine Comedy is an epic without action or characters. It presents an integrated philosophy. It's fully unified, but that its unity is the one apart from the many. That is clearly M2. Again, I remind you, I'm not equating mode with value. Otherwise, I'd have to say that the propagandistic literature of the communists, which is all theme, no events or characters, is the same value as Dante. That would be bizarre. But the mode is the same. Now, I'm going to drop out the medieval science. You pretty much have that. God is omniscient. He rules everything. Everything is a miracle. You learn over it by faith. And the only thing I want to tell you is that when they heard about Aristotle in the 13th century, they were astounded and horrified at first because it threw over everything they believed. And here in 1215, I just copied down from one archbishop, quote, formerly forbade the teaching of the natural scientific work of Aristotle at the University of Paris, together with his metaphysics. And this guy knew what he was doing. But eventually, the scientists, or the equivalent of the scientists in the medieval era, said we cannot ignore this. So they tried to ingest Aristotle, St. Thomas being the most famous example. And some of them argued, we need this to survive. You can't suppress it. Too many people are attracted to it. And the other side said, it's suicide. It's the exact opposite. It'll kill us. Or in famous lines, one side says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And the other side says, we'll build a bridge. So you can see which side won. But to summarize from the modal point of view, it was obviously M2, the all-absorbing one. Education passed again. It was purely ideological. Indoctrination was open only to religious officials, priests, and so on. And you can figure out, as far as rationalism in education, you know that's the home of scholasticism. How many heads can dance on the, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? etc. But their rationalism was integrated. It was all starting from dogmas of faith. It wasn't just a heap of propositions. Now I want to look at the end here at politics, because that is more important. Try to get it in. The church took centuries of bitter struggle to reach its political goal. It was not the political authority just when Rome fell. It finally won because it had an unbeatable weapon. All the people opposing the church in the West agreed with the church on all the dogma, on the morality of the church, on God as being the source of morality, etc. So the kings, the non-church kings, were totally agreed in this. They all agreed that the exalted status among men is the priest, who's oriented to God, not the temporal, the ruler of the world of time, who's oriented to this world. So they just had to draw the conclusion that it's not a division of labor. And the Pope had many ways of breaking these kings, really good ways, but pretty obvious once he did them. One thing, for instance, he excommunicated a king if he disagreed on something significant. And then he'd excommunicate the whole nation, or he'd threaten the whole nation. Of course, that at that point mean eternal death and torture. But he would say, if you overthrow the king, you're absolved. So a king has a lot of problems in that situation. Anyway, by various means, in essence, by purely ideological means, even though with some physical help here and there, by spiritual means, the church finally triumphed. And as I say, in the 12th through the 14th century, they had an essentially unchallenged theocracy. Now, they did not have the technology necessary for total power, but they did come as close to it as was possible at the time. Much, much, much closer than the most megalomaniacal Roman emperor could have dreamed of. At its height, the papacy controlled not only the formulation of dogma, but also treaties between nations, treatment of widows and minors, war and peace, the legal system, disposition of property, marriage and divorce, usury, universities, libel, wills, sex, sorcerers. Oh, I just couldn't give it to you all. Innocent III, one of the best here examples, quote, conceived the papacy as having a general power of review, which could be extended at need to any sort of question. The church itself being the only judge of need. So we can only do what's necessary, but we decide what's necessary. Now, the church understood that its whole success depended on ideology, on Christianity, on philosophy. So the greatest threat that it faced was not political competitors or internal scandals, or certainly not war at the time, but ideas. Ideas that deviated from the orthodox. In other words, heresies. See, the Roman emperor did not think their tenure depended on the whole philosophy. They were picked as God, and they went on from there. But here, their whole entire mission depended on ideology. And therefore, heresies was the great threat. Because if they would spread, they could start jeopardizing the faith of the innocent and thereby turning people away from God, tearing away from man, his only asset and hope, which is salvation. So this is an evil that has to be smashed. It's a divine imperative for both philosophical and practical reasons. Now, I have to say that virtually all heretics, You remember, this is the Middle Ages. We're not talking about Thomas Paine or, people in a later era. Virtually all heretics agreed with their non-heretical contemporaries in being devout Christians. So they hadn't the least intention of subverting Christian dogma or jeopardizing Christian souls. They thought there was merely some relatively insignificant wording or some little point here that wasn't consistent that they would correct or elaborate and therefore make Christianity even better. But of course, the Christian leadership regarded any such innovation, even the tiniest, as the vilest treason against all values and authority. In other words, they really understood that you cannot combine intellectual independence and unquestioning faith. As soon as you allow one, then you're saying faith is limited, something is allowed to push up next to it, and then that's the end. That was the argument against Aristotle, which they finally lost. But for centuries, they were okay. Now, for many centuries, going all the way back to Rome, Christians had regarded heresy as a crime, and many of them wanted to impose punishment. But they didn't have the political power to do so. But in the 13th century, they finally had the power. And they set out to catch the criminals. And they said, we are doing nothing more than Jesus himself told us to do. In the Gospel of St. John, Jesus says, quote, if anyone abide not in me, he shall be cast forth as a branch and shall wither, and they shall gather him up and cast him into the fire, and he burneth. So that is the blueprint. So they said, how do you find a heretic? You have to make inquiries into what people think. So if you want to find a mass of heretics, you must find a mass of inquirers. And of course, that whole procedure is the institution of inquiring, or as we call it now, the Inquisition. That was just a name for all these inquirers. And they had rules and hierarchies, domains, territorial disputes, etc. Now, they were not in the Inquisition. This is the most important, and I think largely unknown. The Inquisition as an institution was not concerned to detect political opponents. It wasn't as though there were little cells that were working for, quote, regime change, the way they call it today, and that they had to put them down. That would be inconceivable in the medieval era. And their motive, as far as you can judge, was not punishment. It wasn't vindictiveness. They didn't want to get back at it and slap these people down because they didn't have to do the things they did. They could have just shot them in cold, or not shot them, but whatever the fastest way. But the inquisitors stated repeatedly they did not want to harm their enemies. They were enacting Christian love, love for the heretic himself. Why? They were changing his thinking. They were creating in him Christian ideas and feelings, and thereby ensuring his salvation. Torture, yes, but it's an ephemeral infliction of pain necessary for them to reach very soon the eternity of joy. All I have to do is reorient their mind. So I don't think the institution was motivated by powerless hatred or sadism. They saw themselves, at least officially, and in their practice, as healing moralists. I think a lot of them were really sincere. Undoubtedly, they had thugs, and the crowds who watched were obviously rotten. I mean, these people were too, but I think there's a lot of sincerity in a lot of these people. And if you can see this, I'll just give you one example out of many. They take the condemned man, he's been found guilty, he wouldn't change his mind under the worst tortures, invincibly repentant. Well, they don't then just shovel him into the fire. They don't gloat over him. From the moment of sentencing, he had a confessor. And the confessor stayed next to him and prayed by his side, beseeching him to repent, because it was so crucial that God's idea be present on earth and not be sullied, not be corrupted by the darkness down here. And they continued the prayers and the pleas until the very last moment. They mounted him on the pyre, they bound him to it, they started the fire at the bottom, and they were still begging him to repent. And everybody knew if he just put his head like that, they'd still burn him, because that was the decree, but then he would go to heaven forever. And to the last second. Now, actually, if they were motivated, by something other than ideology, it's hard to figure what it is. Now, I think it's obvious that this whole approach has no basis in observation. So I won't bother showing you that they're all concepts independent of percepts. You'd go and look at the wine and wafer and tell me what message you get out of it in a Catholic church. I'll take care of the role of perception. Now I just want to point out the difference here again between absolutism, as in the Roman emperors and the 17th century monarchies, and totalitarianism, as in the Christians, the medieval, the communists, and the fascist states. The absolutists on the whole left man's mind alone. They were seeking action control, and they were interested in your beliefs as a side issue only if and when they thought your belief was a practical threat or a personal affront. But the totalitarian approach does want total control, not only of action, but of every aspect of man's life, above all of his thought, because they know that it's thought that controls all the rest. So I have to say, without any hyperbole, it is the Christian religion, it is Christianity that invented totalitarianism. They were the first maybe in all history, but I don't know the Orient that well. They were the first in the West to create the entire system, the philosophy of it, and they were ever after the archetype, the cause, the only model that the communists and Nazis could look to know what kind of state to create. And they stole, modern totalitarians stole even many details from the Christians. So if you saw in the medieval period God to the Inquisition, that exact same transition is the dialectic process to Siberia. And one is just a rewording of the other. I can't imagine that modern totalitarianism would have been possible without this. Now, Christianity itself didn't lead to that, but it gave everything necessary. In that sense, I'm not supposed to give evaluation. Okay. Now, I think you can see that this is obviously Platonic. State is the divine reflection of the one, and there's no individuality because all things are merged in Corpus Christi. It's M2. Now, I just want to say in conclusion that I never covered the Renaissance because I take that roughly 1400 to 1600. I don't believe the Renaissance is an integrated cultural period. I tried to find, and I couldn't. In education and politics, it's pretty consistent. In art, in literature, it's all over the place. And it's just the beginning of science and the juxtaposition, for instance, in people like Francis Bacon, of the wildest mysticism and their study of induction. Obviously, the whole period had not yet, they didn't know what to do with the medieval fervor, which still existed, and the exciting secularism, which was all around. And so you got all different combinations People were confused. The whole thing, the bombshell of Aristotle and the medieval, was the most unexpected development in the whole of West. It shattered a culture as profoundly and unexpected has never been done again. So it took them a couple hundred years to figure out that those M1, it's obviously right for M1, the rising secularism and the fading religion, but still religion as the foundation. But it took them a couple of years to go all the way, a couple of centuries. So I wouldn't give them a mode, or maybe / M1. All right, that's our whole historical survey. I'm going to try to make it shorter, but I already cut so much. If I cut any more, I'll say, well, you take my word for that. Let's just forget that. So I'm assuming you'd rather get a point than not. Thank you very much. Now, next time, we're going to go back to Greece, but on the assumption that we know the mode of each period, try to figure out what are the factors involved in one mode collapsing and the next mode rising, and see if we can get some knowledge of the factors that might help us understand where we are today and what factors might be relevant, and then maybe at the end, look at the United States and see how those factors apply. So you have to bear through one more historical thing, and then the last 3 lectures are the United States. All right, some question. Why is there not long lines? Is it too difficult? Huh? Usually there's long lines. Okay, yes.
I don't know anything about the religious history that I'm going to refer to, but could you compare this Beatrice writer with Augustine?
Well, Augustine was a philosopher. He had a total view of life. And he had a lot more individuality than Beatrice because, he was a pagan, a sinner. And his famous prayer, God, give me chastity, but not yet. So he had a lot of interest in things of this life. And then he became a religious philosopher. But Beatrice is just a symbol in a poem. So, it's not a comparison to say they both were Christian. Doesn't mean a thing.
Yes, hello, Dr. Peikoff.
I'm supposed to go. I'll next. Yeah, okay. Loud, please, I can't hear.
In the previous series that you gave on the dim hypothesis, you said around the Civil War, and I don't want to make you give away something that's in a later lecture. So.
I can make out a word.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. In the
don't
previous.
Talk so fast.
Okay.
Slow.
In the previous series, DIM Part 1, you said that around the time of the American Civil War, there was almost an M1 about to arrive before Kant came along.
All I had in mind was the Scottish realists, who were very influential right after the Enlightenment, in the early 19th century, in American colleges. And it looked like, for a brief period there, it often was called like a return, a renaissance of religion, because they were pure M1. They were worldly, but all morality derived from God. He was a creator, but it never lasted at all. It lasted only in that finally there was an idealist tradition. But the idealist tradition in this country, like Hegel, certainly influenced the politics, but it didn't dominate the culture.
What was that movement called?
The Scottish realists.
Okay, thank you.
Over here, yeah.
The Iliad was written a few hundred years before.
Too loud. I can't make it up. Okay.
The Iliad was written a few hundred years before Aristotle, and yet, or before there was any explicit philosophy, yet it served as a prime example for the I mode for you. Does that mean that, was that because within Greek culture there was implicit the view of reality that Aristotle expressed before Aristotle
Well,
expressed it.
I understand your point, and it's a good point. A lot of the elements that Aristotle systematized were explicitly presented and known. If, for instance, the Thales statement, all things are water, were not understood in the philosophic way of there is one universe and there is something governing it, and we can ask these questions, and we can do it without going on our knees to God. If that wasn't understood, there wouldn't have been Anaximander and Anaximenes and the whole group after them. So in that sense, philosophy was, I would say, more than implicit. I mean, it was unworded, maybe, in any way that survived in writing, but it was known. And the same is true. If you asked Hippocrates, or if you asked Euclid, where's the epistemology which you're using? He would very easily come and say, well, if you accept this, you must accept this, because otherwise it'll be a contradiction. But it's left for Aristotle to put everything in explicit terms. But no, a lot of it was more than implicit, and a lot of individual statements were very explicit. It is true that at the early stage, you could not have an Aristotle before you had enough development so that he could say, oh, okay, I'll put it all together. You couldn't have had an Aristotle without Plato, because Aristotle did not discover concepts, Plato did. So, and Plato couldn't have done it till there was enough concretes to know what concept, enough known, to single out. So they were I's, but that doesn't, you're trying to say, here's a realm of I mentality that didn't have philosophy, so doesn't that refute you? No. It's a good question, but it doesn't. Now, 100 questions like that are in my book, although not that one. I got to take another one this time.
Yes. I have a question also going back to the Greek topic from yesterday. The Greeks had a mindset of a strong contrast between we who are Greek, we who have logos and art that is simple and so on, as against Eastern mystics or barbarians. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you have comments about the way in which that contrast fed into the Greek method idea.
The way it contrasts to what?
It feeds into the Greek idea of method and it being an I type of approach.
I can't hear the last part. I don't know why. All my life I've heard questions, but the Greeks had the idea of their superiority because of their region to the Orientals. And how does that contrast to what?
Well, I'm wondering how that might have contributed to or fed into the formation of the Greek method, because of the differentiation that they had between people who weren't like them and the way that they were.
Well, I think they had their philosophy first. I mean, if they scorned, non-Greeks as barbarians, and that is a Greek word, barbar, which is their way of saying nonsense, or what, insignificant, bad, and that's how they treated the rest of the world. They were the barbar. So they had a unique sense of their own value. And, you could make a case that in the early pre-Greek era, I've heard a historian that tremendously impresses me, discussing the origins of Greece. And one of the things he said that preceded it was a group of warrior heroes who had tremendous self-esteem but no knowledge. And that it could very well be one of the things that contribute to it. But before, that didn't, in that era, contribute. It's just one element. It had to be conceptualized what its presuppositions and implications are. And that's where the Greeks come in. And only then can you say, look what I am versus what they are. Otherwise, it's just, I feel this and I don't like them, but it's not you were over here, yes.
I hadn't realized that Virgil was so against rational selfishness. I had thought that there was a lot more continuation from the Greek period. So I'm curious.
Virgil was so against what?
Rational selfishness, like it was, the duty premise was...
Oh, yes. No, why did you not think that?
Yeah. So do you recommend reading Virgil? I confess I haven't read any yet.
Well, I'll tell you, that was the most exciting experience of my life, but for an extracurricular reason. I had worked on my theory without having read Virgil. And then I realized I have to read Virgil because that is Roman literature. And I was frankly frightened because if Virgil didn't fill in, that ended my whole analysis of Rome, no matter what the rest was. And if that didn't fill in, where was I? So I decided, I made a list, I think it was about 12 points that I had to find in Virgil, not as philosophic statement, but in the, and if I didn't, that's it. And I had great trepidation, and I was absolutely spellbound. Every one of those 12 points was there, and I had Homer on one side and Dante on the other. It was perfection. So for me, Virgil is one of the greatest things ever. But whether you want to read it, it doesn't compare to Homer. There's a lot of shipwrecks and stuff because we don't know what God is doing. So, there's one episode after the other. It's not nearly as interesting. Both Dante is more interesting because, he's got a moral progression. And Homer has an action progression, but Virgil, the only good thing is a love affair. When you have hope the first time, somehow they're going to escape. But I wouldn't recommend it, no. You have time for one? I get one extra minute. Oh, I've used it. No, I get 2 minutes. So I have one last question.
So I understand in general the mode of integration of the culture's dominant philosophy kind of comes first and is in turn the fundamental cause of all these manifestations we're talking about in particular domains in literature, education, et cetera. But
I can't hear you. So just give me your question briefly.
Sorry. Has it ever happened or could it happen on your theory that a work of literature emerges, let's say, that's against the grain, that's not actually consistent, or would it just not?
I mean, you're asking me this. Could Ayn Rand emerge in Soviet Russia? Yes. But, wait a minute. If Soviet Russia were the world of Anthem, where there were no trace of an influence beyond it, and you were brought up from the very first moment to know there's nothing, she could be Ayn Rand, but she'd have a hell of a lot harder time. She had access growing up to a lot of Western literature, and it made a huge difference to her, the discovery of heroes and the way the West was approached. I don't think there's any case in which M2 has a good non-M2 literature has arisen out of the real totalitarian. First of all, it would be, if it's real totalitarian, they would rip it out. They would destroy it. You would be terrified. Now you could do it underground, but then the question is, if the person would have to be a philosopher of some kind, because you can't just sit down and write a novel if you believe the state is supreme, and if you don't, you have to say, well, it's because the individual is, but why the individual? Well, because that's reality. I mean, if you'd have to have a philosophic mind. Now, I believe philosophers arise sometimes, arise out of corrupt cultures, but if they got no help at all from anything before, and the culture was really tightly closed and rotten, honestly, I can't imagine. Even to a genius, I can't imagine that they would even have the freedom to think long enough to do it. And we that lived in Kira always had to go to meetings, useless meetings, but that was one of the techniques that you couldn't think to oppose the realm because you had no time alone. You just were constantly surrounded and then you went to sleep. I don't think that would be possible under those circumstances. Now, if an infusion of literature like Aristotle was brought in, then, it's a disaster to the regime, and then they either kill them all, but they were, actually, now that I said so many bad things about the Christians, I have to say this. Many of them were too good to do it. They saw an element in Aristotle that they could not resist, and, their idea was we can prove anything by deduction from the right axioms. We're just going to put him into the system. Okay, thank you very much.